In 1967, a Soviet cosmonaut climbed into a spacecraft he knew was going to kill him. He had read the engineering reports. He had counted the faults. 203 of them. He knew the ship would not survive re-entry, and he flew anyway. Not because he wanted to die, but because if he refused, his best friend would take his place. Vladimir Komarov was not just any cosmonaut. He was the best the Soviet Union had ever produced. A trained fighter pilot, an aerospace engineer, and the first man ever to fly in space twice. Komarov was the person the Soviet space program trusted above everyone else. But in 1967, the Soviet Union was losing the space race. America was closing in on the moon, and Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev needed a victory, badly. The mission was called Soyuz 1, and from the moment it was designed, it was a disaster waiting to happen. Soviet engineers were terrified. In the weeks before launch, they compiled a report listing every fault they had found in the Soyuz 1 spacecraft. There were 203 structural and engineering problems, 203 things that could go wrong, and not one of them had been fixed. The engineers tried to get the mission canceled. They wrote letters. They raised objections, and every single one of them was ignored, because canceling the mission would embarrass the Soviet leadership. And in the Soviet Union, that was not an option. Komarov knew everything. He had read every page of that report. And here is the moment that defines who this man was. He went to see Yuri Gagarin, his closest friend, the most famous man in the Soviet Union, and he told him the truth. The mission was suicide. Because Gagarin was the backup pilot. If Komarov refused to fly, Gagarin would fly instead. And Komarov knew that the Soviet Union could not survive losing Yuri Gagarin. So Komarov made his decision. He would fly the broken spacecraft. He would take Gagarin's place. He would die, so his friend didn't have to. On April 23, 1967, Vladimir Komarov was sealed inside Soyuz 1 and launched into orbit. Within hours, everything began to fail. One of the two solar panels failed to deploy. The spacecraft began losing power. The navigation system malfunctioned. Komarov was spinning in orbit, unable to stabilize the ship. On the ground, engineers scrambled for solutions. In orbit, Komarov worked the controls with everything he had. Calm, precise, methodical. A pilot doing what pilots do. For nearly 24 hours, he fought that broken spacecraft alone. And then the decision came from the ground that everyone had feared. They were bringing him home, and everyone in that room knew what that meant. Re-entry began, and for a few minutes, it seemed like it might work. Komarov's voice on the radio was steady, professional, controlled. And then the parachutes failed. The primary parachute tangled. The backup parachute tangled with it. Soyuz 1 was falling at over 400 miles per hour with nothing to slow it down. What happened next was recorded by Soviet intelligence and declassified decades later. In his final moments, Vladimir Komarov was connected by radio to Soviet Premier Alexei Kosygin. Officials heard him crying, not from fear, but from rage. Rage at the people who had sent him up in a spacecraft they knew would kill him. He also spoke to his wife, Valentina. What he said to her was never officially recorded. But she was never the same afterward. At 7:24 a.m. on April 24, 1967, Soyuz 1 hit the ground at full speed. The retro rockets fired on impact, making it worse. The capsule caught fire immediately. Soviet rescue teams reached the crash site within the hour. What they found was almost unrecognizable. Vladimir Komarov was given a state funeral. His ashes were placed in the Kremlin wall, the highest honor the Soviet Union could give. The Soviet government told the world he had died in a tragic accident. They said nothing about the 203 engineering faults, nothing about the engineers who tried to stop the launch. Nothing about the fact that everyone knew. Yuri Gagarin was devastated. He demanded to be put on the next Soyuz mission, the one originally planned to follow Komarov's. Soviet leadership refused. They could not risk losing him too. Less than a year later, Yuri Gagarin was dead too, killed in a routine training jet crash. The circumstances were never fully explained. For decades, the full story of Vladimir Komarov was buried under Soviet secrecy. The engineers who had tried to stop the launch were silenced. The report with 203 faults was classified. It wasn't until the Soviet Union collapsed and classified files began to surface that the world finally understood what Vladimir Komarov had done. He did not die because the mission failed. He died because he chose to. He read the report. He counted the faults. He looked at his friend's face, and he made a decision that no engineering report could ever prepare a human being to make. There is a piece of Vladimir Komarov on the moon right now. NASA astronauts carried a memorial medallion bearing his name on Apollo 12 and left it on the lunar surface in his honor. The man who was sent to die so a space program could survive is remembered on the world he never got to see from safety. Vladimir Komarov knew exactly what was going to happen. He went anyway. And somewhere between courage and sacrifice, that is the most human thing any person has ever done.